Do you like my jacket? A couple weeks ago during CES earlier this month, NVIDIA announced their 5000 series cards. And they made some pretty bold claims throughout the video. One was that a 5070 would compete with a 4090 from a performance perspective, even though when we look at the specs and the data sheets, we know that's not going to be the case. They're going to be using a lot of AI trickery and upscaling to kind of compete in that market space when it comes to 4K. As we're getting close here to the end of the month, we're going to start seeing, hopefully, some of these benchmarks and stuff come out to get the true understanding of how well 5070s will perform and what it means overall. Make a pretty bold claim here, though, that the way that we measure performance in video cards is going away the way of the dodo. Currently, we measure a lot of performance with FPS. FPS has been our key metric of tracking, frames per second. Pretty bold statement. But with the way the AI is scaling and what they're measuring, especially if we take a look at the slides that Jensen had up on the screen during CES, they call out AI tops, which is essentially your AI trillions of operations per second, which basically means how fast that card can calculate your AI processing power to do the things that it needs to do with AI, such as DLSS 4. And that's where you're going to see your performance boosts when you start looking at a variety of different things when you start measuring that performance. So FPS might be something where it's like, okay, well, I have a card here that, does 60 FPS in raw power, but if I flip DLSS 4.0 on, I get 240 frames per second because it's injecting frames and upscaling the frames in between so that you get a better visual and hopefully not as artifacty and not as slowed down due to latency issues when you turn those features on, which is what they've really been striving towards these last couple of years. Don't forget, DLSS dropped with the 2000 series card. So it's been iteration after iteration with the 3000, now the 4000, and into the 5000 series cards. If we take a look at performance overall and what NVIDIA is touting from a 5070 perspective, you've got a number of games down here, and we'll get our true details in the next couple of weeks. But basically, you've got 5070 versus a 4070 is what they're touting here. And with ray tracing for Resident Evil 4, they're talking a 1 times performance gain to maybe, I don't know, not even 1.5. Not a lot of an increase here when we look at the actual games itself. Same thing with DLSS with Horizon Forbidden West. Frostpunk with DLSS 4, you start seeing that increase dramatically, right? So again, baselines on the bottom and then what they're saying. And they're using it from a comparison of 1440p, so it's not even 4K, max settings, DLSS super resolution and ray construction on 40 and 50, frame gen on 40 series, and multi-frame gen on 50 series. And then Horizon Forbidden West only supports DLSS 3, which they don't really market there. They just say that. So what they're saying is with DLSS 4 and all of the features with frame gen and your multi-frame gen and what they're doing, your performance increases on a 5070 over a 4070 are through the roof. They're almost 2 times the performance. So if you get 100 frames as an average, you will get almost 200 frames in Indiana Jones. And that's because they're doing a 4-time multi-frame gen mode and what they're generating those frames for. Now, is that real frames or not? What is the latency? All sorts of questions come into play because usually as you increase frames, when you do this frame generation, you increase the latency within the game because it's injecting those frames and the slowdown of the game happens. So you'll see things like 40 milliseconds of latency, 60 milliseconds, 80, 100, whatever it may be. There is another tool, I'll call it a tool because it's similar to this, but it's not the same, called lossless scaling that everybody's making a big deal about. Lossless scaling is a post-processing technology. It's not happening in the game like DLSS and AMD's FSR. So those are more driver and in-game implementations. They are not post-processing like the lossless scaling. So when you look at AMD and you look at NVIDIA, when they do FSR and they do DLSS, they have that built into the game. So the game can actually do basically vectoring to understand the movements to reduce artifacting on a variety of titles. If you don't have those, right, then you don't have the ability to actually leverage those. You have to use something else, like the driver implementation for AMD. They've got the fluid motion, right? I think it's AMD's frame fluid motion. That is a driver implementation of frame generation. Doesn't have to be built into the game to support it. It's at a driver level. So there's various versions of this technology with different implementations. And that's kind of what we need to look at overall too, is how are they utilizing these tools in these games? Because if a game does not support DLSS and it does not support FSR, you cannot use those. So now you're back to the raw power. Like, what are you going to do with a 5070 series card that, let's say, over last gen, over a fourth gen, let's say that we'll use basic numbers. Let's say you're playing Resident Evil and you get 100 frames per second, right? This little small increase over here on Resident Evil 4 with the new 5070 series, that might be 10%. So at 100 frames, 10% is 10 frames. You're getting a 10% uplift off of that, right? And that's it. Because this title doesn't support DLSS, FSR, whatever it may be, right? Doesn't support it. So you need to think about the games that you're playing and the tools or the ability for them to utilize whatever you're purchasing. So when we think about it from a consumer perspective, right? So let's say I'm on a 3080 at my house. I use DLSS in a lot of titles. I don't notice any artifacting. Doesn't bother me if there's some hitching and things here. I don't notice the latency. It doesn't, to me, I don't perceive it, right? Some people may be a little more sensitive to that. I don't see it. So for me, going from a 3080 to, let's say, like a 5080, right, is one of those things to where maybe I'll see an uplift on certain titles that I'm playing, but I might not see it enough. So for me, DaVinci Resolve, right? So this is one that I would look at, which I kind of like that they included. There is a small tangible uplift in probably rendering, right? And these settings are at 4K, max, DLSS super resolution for the 40s and 50s, and the frame generation, right? But you can see, again, depending on whatever the baseline is, you're not going to see an uptick on Resident Evil 4, Horizon Forbidden West, whatever it is. So whatever my base frames in, I'll see a small amount of rasterization and uptick, but I'm not going to see massive bumps that utilize the DLSS 4 technology like Frostpunk 2 or Hogwarts or Star Wars Outlaw. I don't play those titles. I'll see it in Cyberpunk, Indiana Jones, Black Myth, whatever it may be. Black Myth is a funny one because we've seen that under the raw performance of a 4090, you get about 30 frames, 25 frames. I think it fluctuates. But when you flip DLSS on, they spiked it up to like 160, 200 because that AI was injecting those frames and cleaning that all up. So keep in mind when you're looking at these cards and the functionality, you want to be able to make sure that you can utilize the technology that's in there because you're not going to see a massive performance increase. And I think what you're going to see is a little bit of disappointment with this series of cards. So keep that in mind as you're looking for these cards and you're in the market. If you're looking to upgrade, you're probably not going to see a tangible difference upgrading from a 40 series to a 50 series. There's not much difference. Outside of the use of DLSS, you're probably not going to see the raw power any change. So keep that in mind when you're looking at upgrading. And don't forget, they are going to be offering DLSS 4 for lower tier cards, just that most likely a restrictive, certain things will not be available from a functionality perspective. But they have made a few statements that DLSS 4 will be coming to lower cards all the way to RTX 2000 series. So keep that in mind when you're in the market and looking. Does your title support DLSS? If it doesn't, you're not going to see the power and the change based off your current gen unless you're a few generations behind. So if you're on a 2000, maybe a 3000, I would say 3000s are still pretty considerable cards for the market for 1440p. Not so much 4K unless you're really utilizing DLSS. But at 1440p, a 3080, 3070s, they're still pretty solid cards. So keep that in mind as you're in the market and you're looking. NVIDIA's marketing material is really geared towards that DLSS 4, the AI upscaling that they're offering, and everything else to throw in that trickery. So don't get fooled by it. Don't think you're going to go out and buy this 5090 and you're going to, have massive increases in rasterization. Those days are gone. And that's kind of the second half of this video that I want to talk about. The days of FPS and rasterization are dead. The future of neural rendering and upscaling with AI is here, and NVIDIA is forcing it down our throats, right? And they're not going to be the only ones. AMD is going to go down this same exact path as well, because we're starting to get to those probably theoretical limits of what we can push from a power perspective, right? And what it's going to mean. Because if you're in the market and you want to go to a 5090 and you haven't upgraded your machine in a long time, you got to probably upgrade your power supply. It's got to be compliant with ATX 3.0. You got to make sure you have enough wattage, especially to push the 5090. Those 5090s have like a 575 watt like TDP. They're massive, right? They require a lot of juice. Even though they're more efficient card, most likely, they're still pushing a lot from a power perspective. So keep that in mind when you're looking at those things. But from an overall perspective, I think we're going to be in the realm of frames per second will no longer matter. You're going to be looking at the visual acuity of how well the game feels to you, because frames, if they continue this frame generation and this DLSS, there's a high chance that if they're talking these massive upticks here, like Frostpunk 2, let's say you're at 100 frames and they're getting almost 2 times plus that performance, right? So that's another 100 and plus frames. You're at 200 frames. So that's great. If you're on a 165 hertz monitor, you can lock in your frames per second at 165 frames and play your game and have no issues whatsoever. If you're at a 240 hertz monitor, you're moving up. If you're at a 400 hertz, 600 hertz, whatever they are, whatever they're going up to now, you can continue to push those limits when it comes to those frames. So at some point, I think we're going to be looking at other metrics to measure the performance. One is latency, right? You don't want to have a lot of latency in these games because then it will feel like a bad experience. You will not have the smoothness, right? That fluidity that you think when you're moving the mouse and moving around on the screen, you're going to lose that with that latency. It'll feel slow and sluggish, which a lot of people are worried about with DLSS 4. But rumor has it that NVIDIA has been making a lot of strides on that front and fixing things like that and figuring things out so that you don't have high latency when it comes to implementing these upscalers. The other thing that you implement with heavy movements and injecting the frames is artifacting, right? The algorithm is trying to determine, the frame in between, and there are vector motions in there, right? There's vector movements that it can determine because it's DLSS is built into the game. It kind of knows what can go on. You can get artifacting still, and there is still some in there, but they've been working on that, so we will see. So higher frames, more movements, more artifacting, higher latency turns out to have a bad experience. But I think you're going to start seeing that to be another metric as well with your latency. You're going to start to see how many frames is it actually injecting. Will there be artifacting, which can't really track on a metric perspective, but you're going to start seeing things like that. Then they will have FPS just to probably track. But I think FPS as a metric for tracking is going away. It's not going to make a difference. If you can push 1,000 frames out using an AI algorithm, what the hell's the point? It becomes a number. It just becomes a number. It doesn't become anything that you need to, be like rate on a scale. That's great. So we can push 4,000 frames, 5,000 frames. Whoop-de-doo. But what is that doing from an overall experience? So I think we're going to start seeing that shift in that trend as to how do we start measuring those metrics from a trend perspective and from a more of like a fluidity perspective, and how does it feel, right? So how do you measure that with like latency and, the artifacting? How do you measure all of that in there as well? So, in NVIDIA has made these statements a couple years ago, I believe. I'll see if I can find an article and link it up, that pure rasterization and power coming from the cards is dead. Like they don't feel that that was the future, that the future is this AI algorithm. And they're sort of proving their point with DLSS 4. If it's implemented into those titles, you do get a massive increase on those cards, right? And to the average consumer, would they even notice? Like, if you're not in this space and you're not looking for that, would you even notice? Now, I know a lot of us would, right? Because you kind of can see some of the tricks that they do to make sure that the title is optimized to run. And game optimization is a whole separate topic, so we won't even go into that. But they still, I mean, sometimes these games will look like they're smeared with Vaseline because they're doing a lot of this, trickery in the background to kind of blur it and make sure that you keep your constant 60 frames per second, stuff like that. One last thing to touch on, and that is going to be the VRAM situation on a lot of these cards. So VRAM is one of those things where, let me see if I can find the spec sheets here. So VRAM is one of those things that a lot of people bring up a lot of the time. The way that VRAM works, for those that aren't familiar, is the higher the texture and the larger the textures they load into your VRAM on your cards. All right, so that you can access those textures and you can access the items that are cached in your card versus your PC memory, because this memory is much faster and readily available based on the game calling on it. It doesn't have to go back to your memory in your system and come out and all this stuff. So that's why they have this GDDR7, and it's a faster memory response time. Now, your 5070 has a 12 gig VRAM, which a lot of people are kind of questioning. And if we compare that to, let's just say, a 4070, it is faster, right? It's 672 gigs per second versus 504. It was 12 gigs on the 4070 as well. Just GDDR6, it was a slower memory speed. Now, tied with DLSS 4, there is a neural rendering where they're able to reduce the overall size of textures using AI to reduce your VRAM need, which is what they're pushing towards. So if you had a texture that loaded up at 100 meg for the VRAM and it's like a 4K upscaled texture, and it's 100 meg for that texture, they're using AI to reduce that overall texture down to, say, I think I've seen anything from a third to half. So if they can reduce that texture down to, say, 50 megs, you don't need as much VRAM on the card. Again, proof is kind of in the pudding. We'll see how that shakes out. Personally, I have not experienced VRAM issues. I think I have 10 gigs on my card. I'd have to go back and look. I don't really game at 4K though, right? I game at 1440p for most of my stuff. Ultra wide, I hadn't really gamed at 4K. When I did, and I did test it with DLSS on my 3080, I wasn't thoroughly impressed with the performance. It just seemed sluggish and weird, and I just wasn't a fan of it. So I opted away from the 4K and went back to 1440p. I downscaled because it was just better for me. But I did notice when I was at 4K that my VRAM was spiking in certain titles. Like, I think I tested with like Diablo 4 and a few things, and my VRAM was pretty much maxed out. So I know there was an upper limit with the larger, resolutions and upscaling. So if you're gaming at those resolutions, you're going to see that you probably need more VRAM. Now, whether 12 gig is a good number for them and what they're trying to accomplish, I would think this is on the low end based on AMD's offerings, where AMD is like 16 and 24 on their like 7900 XTX cards. So it's a little different, right? So on how they're doing it. And I think they're putting a lot of faith in their neural rendering when it comes to DLSS and utilizing that texture reduction. Again, the problem is if your title doesn't support DLSS, you don't get those features. You don't get them. So again, before you go and you purchase these cards and you think they're going to be a flat out upgrade, look at the title that you're playing, ensure that you can leverage DLSS, and think about it when these reviews start coming out. You may not be getting the best bang for your buck because at the end of the day, your title might not support what NVIDIA is touting here. If it doesn't support DLSS, you don't get it. Indiana Jones, case in point for Indiana Jones. AMD folks, they didn't come with FSR out of the box, right? They have to implement FSR. I don't think it's implemented to this day, but FSR is not available for the Indiana Jones title. It was just a DLSS title. So if you didn't have an NVIDIA card, you were kind of shit out of luck. You had to use just your pure rasterization power and hope you could play the game and lower the settings in the game. Which I have an AMD card. I'll probably end up testing that title because I do have a 7900 XTX to see kind of how it performs. But yeah, we'll have to wait and see. So at the end of the day, you know, a couple things to take away here. Native rasterization is most likely dead and on its way out. The way that we're going to be measuring these cards in the future is most likely not going to be from raw power and FPS. It's going to be other metrics that will judge how the card operates. Game reviewers and folks that are reviewing the hardware might have to change some of their testing methods as well, just because if a game doesn't support DLSS, you're probably not going to see a lot of upticks on those cards going from a 4090 up to a 5090. I will be shocked, but I think the 50 series cards overall are going to be a big disappointment for people that think they're going to get this generational leap. And that's not going to be the case, right? NVIDIA is not really touting that because they're putting a lot of pressure on DLSS 4, but I think you're going to be highly disappointed in these cards. Now I will eat that statement if I'm wrong, but I'm thinking just based on what NVIDIA is selling, what they're pushing, and how they're pushing it. And if you look at the marketing material and you kind of take it with a grain of salt and just understand what they're doing, the games that they've picked and the titles that they've kind of cherry picked out, because these are all cherry picked, right? And they are, you know, they are kind of the same, right? They didn't change anything between each of these models when you go through their site, but they're picking the titles that utilize the technology. And that's kind of the key indicator that, hey, this is more AI based, not pure power. So you're probably not going to see a big generational uplift like we saw from, I'll be honest, when you saw like a 3090 versus a 4090, that was a pretty big generational bump. Like everybody wanted the 4090 because it just ate frames for breakfast. Like it was just crazy. But now a 4090 to a 5090, I do not think we're going to see that big of a generational uplift. So I do not think we'll see the generational uplift that we're thinking. So with that being said, again, quick video, just my take on CES 2025 and the releases and kind of what Jensen and NVIDIA were kind of working on and cooking. Again, I don't think from a hardware perspective, it's going to be a massive uplift. I think you're seeing a much larger software uplift. And I do think that's where the industry is headed with everything, just because it's easier for them to implement this stuff versus redesigning their architecture all the time. They can more focus on the AI piece of it to get those upticks. Now, where things take, if that's wrong, then that's wrong. But I think we're in a shift, right? We're shifting out of all that power and we're going into the AI. So I think that's all we had for the video for this one around. So I appreciate you guys tuning in. Again, like and subscribe if you guys enjoy the content. Again, this is more of just no script, it's just off the beaten cuff, just my opinion on where I think things are going. And at the end of the day, I don't know if this one benefits you guys as the consumer. I think it's more of that generational shift. It's probably going to be a big whiff, but we'll see. All right, we'll catch you guys all in the next one. Appreciate it.